There we go. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this evening, this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are. I hope you're having a good start to your day or end of your day. My name is Emma McKinley. I'm a research fellow at Cardiff University, and I'm the chair of the Marine Social Science Network. MarSocSci is a global community of researchers, practitioners, and anybody really who's interested in understanding those really complicated human dimensions relating to ocean, coastal, and sea-based systems. So we're trying to understand those different approaches in a really kind of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary way. So if you want to find out more, if you're new to MarSocSci, you can find us at our website, marsocSci.net, and follow us on at MarSocSci. And we're really pleased today to welcome Nathan to be part of our webinar series. Dr. Nathan Bennett is an independent consultant and is very much one of the leading voices in marine social sciences. So it's great to have him join us this afternoon. He is leading the People Seas Initiative and is also the chair of the People and Ocean Specialist Group for IUCN. So really kind of bringing a lot of his work over the last few years around social justice and equity in the ocean into this talk today. So it's great to have Nathan with us. And Nathan, I'm going to hand over to you because I know you've got lots to tell us. So just so everybody's aware, please do pop your questions in the chat box. But if you've got any questions for Nathan and you're happy to actually come on screen, just put a question mark in the chat box and I'll actually bring you on as a panelist later. If you're having any tech issues, let me know. And if you are live tweeting, please do tag MarSocSci, but also tag Nathan and use our hashtags, hashtag MarSocSci as well. I'll pop all that information in the chat box for you in just a second. So Nathan, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Emma, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for considering this talk and this topic worth some of your valuable time. So in this talk, I'm going to really provide a high-level overview of some of my thinking and work on equity and justice issues in the ocean. And at the same time, I'm going to combine this with a bit of a personal story about how I got interested in this topic, and then how a failed project proposal led to one of my defining streams of work. And throughout, I'm going to highlight really the importance of the marine social sciences in understanding these issues and helping to create a more equitable marine policies and achieve a more just ocean. So about 5 years ago, I really started to think seriously about equity and justice issues in the ocean. And there were a few reasons that I decided that this was an important topic to work on. First, there was my own personal experiences and research on social injustices in marine conservation and small-scale fisheries. I became aware of social exclusion and impacts of marine protected areas. I became aware of the lack of consideration of small-scale fisheries, and I also became aware, because of some work in Thailand, of issues with labor conditions and slavery aboard industrial fishing vessels. A second concern centered around the social implications of the burgeoning ocean economy, and a personal sense and concern that this kind of blue growth was really leading to increases in incidences of ocean grabbing. And third, I was listening to some of my colleagues, and first, among many researchers, policymakers, and advocates, there was this really pervasive crime of logic that kind of bothered me. It was this if-then statement that does not necessarily hold true in the real world. The argument went something like, well, if only we do development or conservation, then this will automatically increase the well-being of local people. And while this is true in some contexts, there's definitely numerous empirical examples from all around the world that show that this fallacy of trickle-down beneficiaries does not really hold true. I also had many conversations with ocean funders and marine conservation advocates, and I kept hearing them respond when I would talk about equity and justice issues with the question, but why? But why do we need to address equity and justice issues in the ocean? Our focus is on protecting the environment. Is that really the responsibility of the conservation community? This lack of concern for equity and justice also kind of bothered me. And then on the other hand, it seemed that most of those working on the ground as NGOs and managers recognize this need to engage with and adopt equitable practices. But many of those were still wondering how to go about it. And this was particularly true because many of those working in conservation and fisheries, NGOs and management positions had been trained in the natural sciences and lacked the tools in thinking socially and applying this to real world practice. So I started to brainstorm and sketch out some different project ideas. And this picture here is, I assure you, one of the more coherent sketches that came out after a while. It shows the basic idea that I tentatively titled Equity and Justice in the Ocean. And the central concept was that equity and justice was a concern across all marine policy realms, including the blue economy, marine conservation, fisheries management, climate adaptation, marine and coastal planning, and global ocean governance. I also was thinking that there's kind of a number of equity and justice related concerns that needed attention across these different marine policy realms. And those, of course, included things like tenure and access, human rights, participation and power, good governance, transparency, human well-being, livelihoods, food security, just to name a few. So I tried to raise funds to develop a cohesive and strategic project focused on these issues. I reached out to a bunch of ocean and science funders to discuss these ideas. Several asked for a proposal. One funder even asked me to write it several times. But in the end, the responses and feedback were always kind of the same. They would say, we don't really work on these types of issues within our oceans portfolio, or we already work on equity or support justice simply by promoting conservation or fisheries management. They would also ask, can you help us to understand why we need to address these issues? Or please help to understand how this will help us to achieve our central mandate. So the truth is that I actually did not have a single successful funding proposal for this project. And honestly, I got quite disheartened and a bit frustrated. But then I decided to turn my frustration and project idea into a paper and publish it. And so this paper is where I started this project, Navigating a Just and Inclusive Path Towards Sustainable Oceans. And I really try to clarify the rationale and aim to draw attention to the need for more focus on equity and justice issues in the ocean. And I also put forward an agenda for future social science research on these issues across a number of different policy spheres. Now, this is not one of my most cited papers, but I do think that it is one of my most important papers. And in the end, for me, this initial project idea, the subsequent failure to get funding, and then a frustration-motivated paper really has led to one of the defining streams of my thinking, research and work for the last handful of years. A few of the main papers that I led related to these topics are shown here, and I will draw from and build on these papers in this talk. But I will also touch on a number of others that were led by myself or others. But I wasn't really able to develop and push forward the cohesive project that I was hoping for. Instead, I hustled and was entrepreneurial. I worked with a variety of collaborators and organizations to push forward a variety of different topics related to some projects and papers that kind of loosely were structured around this stream of work. And I also want to note that many of these were side projects of my main research projects. Some came out with no financial support, but for others, I was able to cobble together small amounts of funding for to support a bit of my time or support meetings of collaborations. But more recently, ocean organizations are really starting to take these topics and this type of work more seriously. So thankfully, that's also led to some funding for some of the more recent papers. I also want to acknowledge that much of this work was not something that I did on my own. It involved many collaborators, and there were some organization that supported various aspects of this loose stream of work. So before proceeding, I just want to acknowledge some of the main individuals that have really guided my thinking in this area. And those include Jessica Blythe, Rashid Sumaila, Natalie Ban, and others with the Ocean Canada Partnership, Terry Satterfield at UBC, and Patrick Christie at the University of Washington. There's many collaborators at the Center for Ocean Solutions, Conservation International Center for Oceans, and the Blue Nature Alliance, including Elena Finkbeiner, Jack Kittinger, Alani Wilhelm, and many, many others. And then I also have done some work with Yoshitaka Oda, Andres Cisneros Montemayor, and others at the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center. And this is just a few people, but there's way too many others that I can't name here. On the right are some of the organizations that I collaborated with and also that supported various aspects of this work financially. And that brings me to the main part of my talk. Here, after this introduction and background, I want to jump into just equity and justice really quickly and provide a definition and rationale for focusing on these issues. Then I'm going to walk through 3 different streams of work related to equity and justice in marine conservation, the blue economy, and fisheries management. And then in the discussion, I'm going to come back to the role of the marine social sciences, look to the future for future areas of research, and issue a call to action. And then I'll leave you with some takeaway messages and hopefully some time for questions. So in this next section, I just want to quickly touch on definitions of and rationales for equity and justice. So I need to just clarify that when I'm talking about equity and justice, I'm using the terms very broadly. In general terms, equity and justice are concerned with fairness in how people are treated or public policies are formulated and implemented. Equity and justice in general are understood to include a combination of both substantive concerns, so outcomes, as well as procedural concerns, so processes. I also want to clarify that in this talk, my focus is on outward application across different spheres of marine policy. So my focus is not on diversity, equity, and inclusion within ocean organizations or in the workplace, though I really do want to note that DEI within organizations is foundational and necessary to achieving equity and justice in external facing policies, programs, and funding portfolios. And I'll return to that point again later in the talk. Current thinking related to equity and justice and the environment really draws from thinking in environmental justice and social justice, as well as in conservation equity. Interestingly, many writings in this field have converged around the use of 3 broad terms or concepts or aspects of justice or equity. So first, people talk about recognitional equity or justice, and this highlights the need to account for knowledge systems, values, social norms, needs, and the rights of all stakeholders and rights holders in decision-making. Second aspect is procedural equity or justice, and this refers to the degree of participation and inclusiveness in rulemaking and decisions around ocean management or conservation programs. And third, distributional equity or justice is about the fair allocation of the costs, benefits, burdens, and rights derived from actions or programs among different groups. Some authors also touch on contextual equity, which refers to the surrounding social conditions that influence actors' ability to gain recognition, participate in decision-making, or lobby for fair distribution. I also want to just clearly articulate why being attentive to social equity and justice is important and why it matters. In summary, there's 3 reasons why it's necessary. First, because it's ethical. Secondly, because it is instrumental to effective conservation or other initiatives. And third, because it is required by global policy. The oceans and coasts are peopled. There's an estimated 600 million people living on the coast, 60 million people working in fisheries and aquaculture, and there's 775 million people worldwide who have a high dependence on the oceans. Some populations are also more highly dependent on the oceans than others. For example, some coastal and small-scale fishing communities, fisheries is their only source of livelihoods. And for indigenous people, they're up to 15 times more reliant on seafood and fish for food security. So of course, conservation actions or management actions will impact these populations in some way. And it is argued, therefore, that it is right or ethical and just generally good practice that these people's rights, needs, and values should be considered and that they should be included in decisions that will impact them. Second, we are learning more and more from social science that considering factors such as good governance, cultural appropriateness, and social impacts are all fundamental to effectiveness. This is because these factors increase legitimacy, they lead to local support and social license, and they improve compliance with regulations. And ultimately, this produces more robust initiatives. All of these factors improve the ecological effectiveness of conservation and fisheries management. And then finally, global agreements and conservation policies documents mandate the consideration of such factors as governance, rights, equity, and benefit sharing. For example, the Aarhus Convention is a multilateral environmental agreement that grants the public rights regarding access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental management. Another example is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that asks that we consider Indigenous rights in all decisions in policies that might affect them. Then there's conservation policies, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, which through the HE targets, as well as through the post-2020 biodiversity framework, ask that attention be given to equitable management, benefit sharing, participation, Indigenous rights, as well as livelihoods. And so there's also a lot of other examples of lower level policy documents. And so these are just a few examples among many. Now I just want to move into the three sort of streams of work that I'm going to talk about. In this first stream of work, I'm going to talk about the types of social injustices that have been caused by marine conservation and how these might be remedied through a focus on social equity. So one aspect of my doctoral research focused on the relationship between marine protected areas and small-scale fishers in Thailand. I spent a year conducting interviews and focus groups, as well as surveys in 7 communities near marine protected areas along the Andaman coast. This is an area of high biodiversity with substantial areas of coral reef, seagrass meadows, as well as mangrove forests. As a result, there's a string of national marine parks that have been created along the entire Andaman coast. But along this coast, there are also more than 600 small-scale fishing communities and more than 50,000 small-scale fishers. And what I learned from my research is that these large no-take marine protected areas were being created in areas used by thousands of small-scale fishers without any consideration or consultation. Understandably, these small-scale fishers felt that the marine protected areas unduly impacted their ability to fish and provided no real benefits or alternative livelihoods to them. Meanwhile, in some areas, large small-scale industrial fishing vessels were able to fish with impunity. Small-scale fishers also resented not being included in management or decision-making processes. And this led to both vehement opposition and even violent conflict, with small-scale fishers getting arrested, staging protests, and even burning down ranger stations. They told me that they purposely fished harder within the areas designated as marine protected areas. Similar issues have also emerged in marine conservation throughout the world. There's numerous academic papers and news items from Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, North America, even the Chagos Archipelago that tell a startling story of marine conservation that has involved lack of inclusion and foregone consent for rights holders, the foreclosure on livelihood options and opportunities for small-scale fishers, the undermining of traditional rights or historical tenure of Indigenous people, or the use of violence or force to evict local people, and also some human rights abuses. Of course, these actions undermine the legitimacy of support for and the success of marine conservation. Indeed, coastal communities, Indigenous groups, and small-scale fishers organizations around the globe have been becoming quite vocal in their opposition to all forms of marine conservation as a result. And there's lots of examples in the literature of how failing to account for local people and address social equity related issues has led to this sort of conservation backlash. What is more of a concern for many of these groups is that there are an increasing number of global commitments and regional agreements to increase the spatial coverage of marine conservation around the globe. This includes, for example, the previous commitment to protect 10% of the world's oceans under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the more recent push towards 30% coverage that is being promoted by numerous organizations and policy bodies. And while there's an urgent need to scale up conservation efforts to arrest global declines in biodiversity, there's also this real danger that the push to rapidly achieve spatial targets in the absence of social equity considerations might just lead to the perpetuation of exclusionary marine conservation models and the undermining of local rights. This is a problem, as we really need more allies, not less, for marine conservation. So a few years ago, many in the marine conservation community were starting to become aware of the types of past and ongoing social injustices that were arising around the globe in the name of marine conservation. Sorry, my screen is doing some strange things here. Hopefully it'll stop.
We've got you back now. Yeah, you're good.
Thanks. And some groups are calling for more rigorous standards, a human rights-based approach, or a code of conduct for marine conservation. So at the World Conservation Congress in 2016, I organized and facilitated a meeting with support from the Nippon Foundation NERIS program to discuss these issues and how to address them. What emerged from this meeting of marine social scientists and practitioners was an appeal for a code of conduct for marine conservation. We highlight the issues and argue for the application of commonly held global policy norms to marine conservation. Since publication, the idea of a code of conduct has had some uptake, with some organizations developing and adopting their own codes of conduct. Grid Rendell also put forward an adaptation as a blue carbon code of conduct at the UN Ocean Conference in 2018. And this was endorsed by over 40 NGOs, as well as 5 academic institutions, 47 members of the scientific community, and the United Nations Environment Program. The last few years since then has really seen a growing recognition of the need for more socially equitable conservation. Yet in both policy and practice, greater attention is still given to what, to how much, and where to protect, rather than how to go about protecting biodiversity and who should be included in the process. And one reason for this is that many of the actors involved in marine conservation, governments, non-governmental organizations, advocates, and funders, they still often lack a clear understanding of what social equity means and how to integrate it into conservation practices. And so I think this represents a barrier to more socially equitable as well as effective conservation. So with support from the Blue Nature Alliance, a group of collaborators and I recently published another paper through which we seek to further advance the field with a specific focus on how the marine conservation community can advance social equity in and through marine conservation. And here in this paper, we expand a little bit upon on the previous frameworks of recognitional, procedural, and distributional to clarify that attention is also needed to management as well as the environment. And we build a little bit on previous understanding of contextual equity to also discuss the structural barriers that exist within conservation organizations themselves. So just really quickly, recognition requires that we acknowledge and respect the dignity of diverse peoples through a focus on rights, tenure, culture, practices, values, knowledge systems, and livelihoods. Procedures requires that we pay attention to participation and aspects of good governance, such as transparency. Distribution requires that we think about how to maximize the benefits and minimize burdens for local populations. Attention to management requires that we move beyond just participation in decision-making processes, which is often what's talked about under procedures, towards championing and supporting local involvement and leadership in management actions themselves. The environment also is often pushed to the side in previous frameworks, so there's often no indicators for that. So we encourage that we need to ensure the efficacy of conservation actions and the adequacy of long-term management in order that marine conservation initiatives provide the promised benefits to nature as well as to people. And then finally, as I noted before, we advocate for a better understanding of the structural barriers to and institutional roots of inequity in conservation, and that we need to address these in the conservation processes and initiatives. There's much more guidance provided in the paper. I wish I could go a little bit deeper into that here. But in the paper itself, we also advocate for the tracking and implementation of social equity in national marine conservation policies, as well as monitoring different aspects of social equity within individual marine protected areas. And this is something that I did in the Mediterranean Sea in collaboration with the Fish MPA Blue 2 project. In 2018, we conducted a survey of small-scale fishers in 11 marine protected areas across 6 countries. And the survey itself included a set of individual indicators for 3 of the aspects of equity: recognitional, procedural, and distributional equity. And we also created a combined sort of composite equity score. And overall, the descriptive results of this survey showed that small-scale fishers' perceptions of social equity were quite varied, but skewed towards positive perceptions. We also developed predictive models to analyze the effects of geographic and individual factors on the composite social equity scores. And then in the models, I guess there's two important takeaways. First of all of the social equity scores differed significantly between marine protected areas, but not by country or many of the other factors. And so what this tells me is that site level focus for managing for equity is really important. The second thing is that only a few of the demographic factors were predictive. So being an older fisher was associated with a decrease in recognitional equity score, while having a higher level of relative wealth or more diversified livelihoods was associated with higher scores for distributional equity. Of course, those last two results are not that surprising. But in general, these results point to the need for tailored management actions to improve equity in different marine protected area sites and for different groups. But addressing equity in marine conservation is not just the purview of managers who are doing marine conservation on the ground. Each of the different organizations in marine conservation has a role and a responsibility to play in advancing social equity. And this includes global policy organizations who must ensure that policy frameworks clearly mandate consideration of social equity and are supported with clear guidance. National governments also have a responsibility to create legislative and policy frameworks that mandate equitable conservation governance, that support co-management practices, or that enable locally led conservation initiatives. Civil societies also should serve as a catalyst for social equity standards and practices. Those organizations and individuals who are engaged in advocacy should develop an awareness of the complexities of the locations where they work, through engaging with the social context. Funders also have significant power and influence over which conservation approaches and actions are taken, and that comes with a coinciding responsibility. Finally, the conservation science community has a role to play through tracking and metrics for social equity and engaging more with the marine social sciences. In the paper, we also dig into the types of capacities that organizations need to adequately engage with and advance social equity in the work. And these are at three different levels. So first, the institutional level, second, the procedural level, and third, the operational level. I'm not going to get into each of these points here, but if you want to read a little bit more about that, that's in the overarching paper. But I don't want to leave you with the wrong impression. There's definitely many positive examples all around the world where people's rights, needs, voices, livelihoods, and leadership are recognized and integrated into marine conservation. And I'm not sure if the bullet points are showing up on your screen, but they're not showing up on mine. These do include, the burgeoning number of locally developed and led models of marine conservation, such as locally managed marine areas, indigenous community and conserved areas, tribal parks, customary marine management areas, and territories of life. There's also many national level marine planning processes that are being done in partnership with civil society organizations or indigenous groups. And other marine planning and conservation processes are incorporating social and governance information into their decision-making. And large-scale marine protected areas can also embody these types of principles. For example, Papamohokoakea Marine National Monument in Hawaii incorporates native Hawaiian cultural values and has a reserve advisory council to ensure full inclusion in design and management of the area. And these are just a few of many examples of marine conservation that we need to pursue in order to achieve a more sustainable and equitable ocean. That brings me to the next section of my talk, in which I'm going to touch on equity and justice issues related to and solutions for the ocean economy. So the oceans have always been a site of economic activities. What is new is the scale and speed of growth of economic development in the oceans. Bouffray et al. In their recent paper called this phenomenon a blue acceleration. As global demand for resources has continued to grow and land-based sources have declined, reliance on the oceans for human needs and development has rapidly expanded. As a result, an unprecedented race is occurring among diverse and competing actors and nations for food, for materials, and space. These authors really show how this blue acceleration is occurring across all sectors of the ocean economy, from aquaculture to deep sea mining, from shipping to marine tourism, and from offshore wind farms to marine genetic resources. And what's more, the predictions are that the ocean economy could double or triple in the coming years. So the oceans are increasingly viewed as this new frontier for economic development. And many governments and corporate actors are really promoting this blue growth agenda. And what we've seen is that this idea of a blue economy has been receiving quite a bit of attention in recent years in global and national policy discussions. For some, the blue economy is just a shorthand for all forms of economic development in the ocean. But the original vision for the blue economy, the one that was put forward by small island developing states, was for a form of ocean development that was both equitable and sustainable. Yet, as companies and governments race to capitalize on marine resources, I think that this blue growth can pose substantial risks for both people as well as the environment. Indeed, both civil society organizations and academics have been really sounding the alarm about these emergent issues related to the ocean economy for some time. Civil society organizations such as the World Forum on Fish People, the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers, and the Transnational Institute have pushed back against ocean grabbing and blue justice issues that are being perpetrated by blue growth. The dangers of ocean grabbing are also highlighted in a report from a few years back and a paper that I published with several collaborators in 2015. Muniba Isaacs, as well as researchers from the Too Big to Ignore network and others from around the world, has also been documenting a whole set of environmental and social injustices that are occurring as a result of past ocean-based development, and have issued calls for greater attention to blue justice issues. Yet, in general, the risks of social and environmental justices from blue growth are still insufficiently recognized for those institutions and governments advocating for increases to economic development. Recognizing this, a few of us published a recent paper that explored some of these past injustices produced by ocean-based economic development. The central question guiding our qualitative review of the literature was what social injustices can result from the ocean economy. In brief, our review highlights 10 risks for social injustices: dispossession, displacement, and ocean grabbing, environmental justice concerns from pollution and waste, environmental degradation and reduction of availability of ecosystem services, livelihood impacts for small-scale fisheries, lost access to marine resources that are needed for food security and well-being, the inequitable distribution of economic benefits, social and cultural impacts of ocean development, the marginalization of women, human and indigenous rights abuses, as well as exclusion from decision-making. Our critique's aim is to really directly highlight the worst case scenarios in order to stimulate a rigorous dialogue about how to avoid these types of injustices. Thus, we also touch on solutions to achieve a more just ocean economy. And of course, an obvious starting place is to just flip these social injustices on their head and to say that we need to, and so we developed a set of recommendations for avoiding these injustices. And of course, the need to address these issues is already highlighted in existing international declarations and voluntary agreements, such as those I highlighted earlier, and also in things like the United Nations Declarations on Human Rights or the voluntary guidelines for small-scale fishers, among others. And it's also codified in corporate social responsibility principles. But I do want to note that most of these high-level agreements and policy documents don't really focus specifically on the ocean. A recent blue paper of the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy that I was a co-author on, though, addresses this gap head-on by proposing a set of solutions to promote ocean equity in the ocean economy. The document lists solutions that range from no-regret solutions to transformative solutions. It examines how a sustainable ocean economy should protect human rights, improve human well-being, stimulate inclusion and gender equity, and prioritize recognition, diversity, and equal access to resources. It also suggests that we should address corruption and tax evasion, demand responsible and transparent business practices, and create a shared economy that facilitates fair redistribution of wealth and benefits. And finally, a sustainable ocean economy should be aware of environmental and social limits on growth. And yet, transforming the ocean economy to achieve blue justice may not be a simple task, and tinkering at the margins of state or corporate-led economic development may be insufficient. So achieving blue justice may require a substantial change to ocean governance to include new actors and visions, or a rethinking of our fundamental assumptions regarding development, or a reimagining of novel or alternative models of development, or a complete paradigm shift regarding the need for growth. We go into each of these points further in the paper. That brings me to the end of that section of the talk. And now I just want to switch over to the next section, which focuses on equity and justice issues and solutions in fisheries. And here I want to highlight that research related to equity and justice does not necessarily need to be framed with these terms. Human rights, governance, human dignity, well-being, diversity, gender, food security, and access are all related topics. And indeed, there's been substantial research that has documented the extensive social injustices in fisheries management and across seafood supply chains. These injustices include issues related to loss of rights, tenure, and access for small-scale fisheries, inadequate participation, representation of voice of fishers in management and governance, the further marginalization or complete lack of consideration of some groups, including women and Indigenous people. Of course, the inequitable distribution of economic benefits to different groups and of the economic benefits across the supply chain. And most egregiously, human rights abuses and slavery has been documented in many fisheries around the world. So recognizing these issues, a global team led by Jack Kittinger of Conservation International developed and published a framework in science for incorporating social responsibility into fisheries and seafood. This framework was later adopted as the Monterey framework and has really since been adopted and taken up in developing guidance, in developing monitoring programs for fisheries improvement projects, as well as in guiding the certification frameworks for seafood supply chains. But one question that I've continued to wonder about is, why are these types of social injustices happening in the first place in fisheries? Two issues that I feel have plagued fisheries is inaccurate diagnosis, as well as which has produced inequitable fisheries management, as well as deliberate ignorance of human dimensions, which have led to fisheries decisions that have been highly unjust. So inaccurate diagnosis is often driven by dominant narratives that are applied uncritically and without real evidence. A few of those dominant narratives are things like that fishers are driven to illegal behavior by greed rather than by need, social pressure, lack of capacity or knowledge, or unfair regulations. Another one is Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons theory, which suggests that resource users are unable to manage commonly held resources, and that this will inevitably lead to their collapse. A third is the Malthusian overfishing narrative, which suggests simply that population is the main or only cause of overfishing. And narratives such as these are often used to justify certain policies, such as the criminalization of fisheries, the privatization of resources, or the reduction of fisher access, or even population reduction. And many of these solutions are highly inequitable, and they also are often ineffective. And so we argue in this paper with Elena Finkbeiner, myself, and some others, that it's really necessary to properly understand and diagnose the effects of other mediating drivers, including technology and innovation, resource demand and distribution, marginalization and equity, as well as governance and management. And it's only through properly diagnosing the problem that you're going to be able to diagnose or design fisheries policy and management solutions that are both effective as well as equitable. And there's certainly a huge number of examples of the literature where fisheries policies and management decisions are made without adequate knowledge of the human dimensions. And this has led to injustices, economic marginalization, or undermined human well-being. And I think, this is I do kind of want to provide you with an example of willful ignorance of the human dimensions. So first, many national fisheries policies, management processes, improvement projects, and funding portfolios have either explicit or implicit socioeconomic development or human well-being objectives. And sometimes these are simply economic, but they also include social, cultural, governance, or health objectives. And yet, fisheries management and programmatic decisions, both past and present, are often made without adequate research or empirical evidence on the socioeconomic status of fishers or coastal communities. Yet we know that sustainable fisheries alone are insufficient to improve human well-being. So I would say that decision makers, managers, practitioners, and funders really need to monitor and evaluate socioeconomic and human well-being aspects of fisheries before, during, and after management or programmatic interventions. Otherwise, they're just going to be, shooting in the dark with their decision-making processes. So just as to fill this gap a little bit, in a recent paper in fisheries research, we published some guidance on the development of bespoke socioeconomic monitoring and evaluation plans for those governments, managers, NGOs, funders, or others working in the fisheries space that might want to better understand human well-being. A final justice-related issue that I want to mention that I think deserves a lot more attention in many contexts is access to fisheries resources and the ocean. And access is really important because the viability of fishers and the well-being of coastal communities depends on both availability of and access to resources. This is certainly an important policy issue in Canada, where privatization, corporatization, and consolidation have led to loss of access for independent and small-scale fishers. We conducted a survey a couple of years ago of 118 independent small-scale fishers in communities along the entire coast of British Columbia to better understand access and also well-being of fishers in coastal communities. And I'm just going to quickly touch on those access results. First, in terms of rights, access rights for the fishers were generally perceived as poor, with the exception of transfer rights. And so you can just kind of tell that from the red coloring in this figure. In terms of capacity, participants generally perceive strengths in physical, human, and cultural assets, but varied status in social and financial assets, and weaknesses in political assets. The results of this type of survey, I think, are really important because they can guide management decisions towards addressing issues such as access. And I'm going to skip over the human well-being results. Finally, myself and a few others also take up these broader questions around incorporating justice into fisheries in a paper called Just Transformations to Sustainability. And here we argue that transformations cannot be considered a success if social justice is not a central concern. And so this paper examines the types of practical actions that would need to be taken for distributional, recognitional, and procedural justice to be taken into account in a fisheries transition that's needed on the Pacific coast of Canada. And one of the things that we dig into is this question of distributional equity and what it looks like to take distributional equity into account during that transition period, and how fisheries should be allocated to different groups, including large-scale fishers, small-scale fishers, and subsistence fisheries. So that's kind of covered a lot of ground, and that brings me to the discussion. And here I want to focus on three things. First, the role of marine social science in advancing social equity. Second, future research needs. And then I'm going to issue a quick challenge or a call to action. First, the marine social science community has a real integral role to play in providing the knowledge and evidence needed to make equitable and just decisions related to different marine policy spheres. Because the seas are peopled, it's necessary to understand and integrate the human dimensions into ocean policies and programs. This will really help us to avoid social harms and instead maximize social benefits. So the marine social sciences, of course, is something that this Marine Social Science Network focuses on. And they include a diverse and well-established set of disciplines, methods, tools, and theories that can be applied to rigorously study human dimensions topics. Things such as governance and management, understanding various aspects of the social context, understanding the impacts of different initiatives on human well-being, or identifying social and cultural and institutional factors that influence behaviors, actions, or responses. And so this can be applied to all different marine policy realms. And I think it's important to note that the marine social sciences are a necessary complement at various scales, ranging from individual initiatives all the way up to national policies. For example, most national fisheries policies have a dual environmental and social mandate. This is certainly the case in Canada, where the mandate of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans includes both sustainable management of fisheries as well as the continued prosperities of fishers, coastals, and indigenous communities. And indeed, the updated Fisheries Act really makes space for the inclusion of traditional and community knowledge, social, economic, and cultural factors, and the preservation and also to understand whether or not policies are leading to the preservation and promotion of commercial and inshore fisheries. But the marine social sciences are also needed at the global level. And I think, one global policy initiative that's happening right now is the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And this initiative offers an important opportunity to build on the current interest in and need for the marine social sciences. And the document of the UN Decade suggests that achieving a sustainable ocean requires science-informed policy responses to global change. We all know that the concept of sustainability generally includes environmental, economic, and social dimensions. Yet, I would say in general, there's still lack of an explicit focus on social science within the UN Decade for ocean science. And this is a major shortcoming, and I think something that the UN Decade does need to address moving forward in order to be able to address the social aspects of ocean sustainability. So what are some of those future social science research topics that are priorities? First, I would say that all topics related to the human dimensions of ocean sustainability need more attention. And here's just a short list of some of those topics. My concern is that there are some topics here, uses and activities, human impacts on the environment, and benefits to people receive will receive most of the attention. But I feel that answering these questions of what and where may really miss out on important questions related to how and why. And so I just have highlighted a handful of topics in red, and I think that these are some topics that deserve a lot more attention in order to engage with justice and equity in the oceans. There's also some policy spheres that need more attention. So lots of past attention has been on marine protected areas, fisheries, and climate adaptation. I think we need more attention to marine planning, global ocean governance, and the ocean economy. I also want to emphasize that there's lots of different types of marine social science. There's applied research, there's big picture curiosity and theoretical questions, and there's critical social science. And I would say that all three types of marine social science are really necessary to help us chart a more equitable and just path in the oceans. And then finally, I do think that a focus on research process may be just as important as the product. For example, the co-production of research agendas, knowledge, and practices may help that research to be more impactful. And ethical engagements with research participants can really help us to ensure that we do not exacerbate their situation. Finally, I want to issue a challenge. So we've entered the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainability, and I think we should also be entering the UN or the Decade for Equity and Justice in the Ocean. So my challenge is to ocean-focused government agencies, non-governmental organizations, and funders. I think it's really time to move beyond rejecting, trying to rationalize, or accepting the need to address equity and justice, but really doing little or nothing tangible, towards recognizing that equity and justice issues are fundamental aspects of all aspects of marine policy, and that we need to take action to mainstream equity and justice in the ocean. And what does this require of ocean organizations? I think it requires that they develop familiarity with past and current issues, that they prioritize equity and justice in their policies, programs, management practices, and funding portfolios, and that they examine how to operationalize and take action on equity and justice. I think it also requires that they address organizational human dimensions capacity gaps, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion shortcomings, because this is going to be foundational to achieving equity and justice within their programs. I also think that they need to think about how to employ and engage with evidence from the marine social sciences. And finally, I would encourage them to document and share successes, failures, and lessons learned internally and with other organizations. So that brings me to the end of my talk. The takeaway messages are on this slide. First of all, rapid and unchecked growth of development and conservation in the ocean is producing equity and justice issues. Second, addressing past and emergent issues requires concerted attention to equity and justice across all marine policy realms. Third, equity and justice are central concerns of the marine social sciences. The marine social sciences can provide critical insights and evidence related to the human dimensions of ocean sustainability. Fourth, ocean organizations must embrace and take practical steps to mainstream equity and justice within their organizations as well as their practices. And then finally, fail forward. Be entrepreneurial and persist in your projects. You never know what supports, collaborators, solutions, and outputs may emerge. But I also have to wonder, having gone through this journey, whether I could have done something bigger, bolder, and more strategic if I'd been successful in getting funding. So to end, I want to briefly mention a new project that I'm launching. The Peopled Seas Initiative is a new big picture initiative. It's a central hub for action-oriented research, strategic thinking, and capacity building on human dimensions of ocean issues. Through developing a community of practice, this project is going to address emergent social justice issues and chart a path towards more inclusive and equitable oceans. I'm currently elaborating several streams of work, developing partnerships, and looking for funding. So if your organization might be interested, please let me know. Otherwise, stay tuned for more details. Here's a list of the references that I used in my talk, but I also added many of the papers that I discussed here to a folder on ResearchGate. So please feel free to just check out that folder on ResearchGate. And that brings me to the end of my talk. Thanks so much for your time and for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Nathan. What a fascinating and very thorough and in-depth talk, drawing on so much research and very thoughtful exploration of a real mix of topics. So thank you so much for your time and for really giving us all of that insight and kind of that journey that you've taken around this area of research and your own kind of challenges and experiences within that. We've got some questions in the Q&A box. If anybody's happy to come on to the panel to ask your question in person, let me know. There's lots of thanks and lots of really positive messages. I should also say, Nathan, there was loads of people introducing themselves and getting involved in the chat, so I'll try and save that and send them on to you in case that's of any use. So thank you all for being so interactive, despite the fact that we're doing this in an online virtual world, as always. So some great questions have come in. I'm going to start with the most, got a question and comment over each other. So I'm going with the first one. From Ina, who said, Nathan, thank you so much for an inspiring talk. Can the metrics for social equity also be applied to renewable energy projects at sea?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's good metrics out there that can be applied to fisheries, to marine protected areas, to renewable energy projects and other aspects of the blue economy. Of course, I would encourage the adaptation of all indicator sets to the local context, and that means being aware of what values local people have, and engaging with them in dialogue around those values and how to develop indicators that match that local context. So I think that the frameworks and the sets of indicators that are out there are useful, but I always encourage adaptation to the local context to make sure that they're relevant.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nathan. We've got a question from Liska, who said, again, thank you for the talk, and has asked, do you think the discourse on equity and justice regarding ocean justice can gain valuable insights from the discourse on equity and justice regarding land grabbing? So I guess drawing on some of the points you made around ocean grabbing and the injustices around that, do you think there's an opportunity to draw on the experiences and consequences that have already happened around land grabbing and bring those into a way of developing effective governance to address ocean grabbing?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally and completely think that that those two conversations and those two sets of literature can and should be in dialogue. I mean, one of the things that we see across the marine terrestrial realm is that there's often a bit of a divide where people that are working on terrestrial social issues don't necessarily read or pay attention to the marine social science, and vice versa. And I think those two pieces should be in dialogue. Of course, a fundamental difference between land and ocean grabbing is, I guess, first of all, fluidity. So the oceans are much more fluid than land in many ways, and the resources in the ocean as a result are also much more fluid. You can think of the relative mobility of fish and whales and other marine species. The other thing is that ownership in the ocean is quite different. Part of that is that ownership has a much shorter history. We all know the history of enclosures that has happened in Europe. There was a previous presentation that I gave where I sang a part of the Digger song by Billy Bragg as an introduction to this issue of both land and ocean grabbing and how they can learn from each other. So there's a much longer history in the oceans that the ownership is different. It's more recent that UNCLOS went into effect and enabled nation states to grant ownership over certain areas of the ocean that they didn't have that ability to before 1982, I guess.
Thank you for that great response. I'm really sad that you didn't sing as part of your presentation today. That would have been a wonderful start. We've got a couple more questions, which I hope, if everybody's happy to stick around for a bit longer, I'm really happy to keep going through those. And we've had two that are quite similar, which are related to, there's one question in the Q&A and one question in the chat around how do we get people, such as marine conservation funders, but also I guess the wider kind of narrative in society to fund and support research around social justice. And then Henrika's a question around how do we address the fact that marine conservation funders can often get their resources from businesses that have maybe are currently or have historically supported activities or promoted activities that result in social injustice? So they're two big questions.
Right. I mean, the question of how to get partners and funders interested in these topics. I guess the first is ongoing dialogue and engagement. As I kind of highlighted in my story, there historically has been this real resistance to engaging in these topics of justice and equity. For example, in the marine conservation realm, I would say a decade ago, if you started giving a critical talk or offering some critique of marine conservation initiatives, people would get up and walk out of the room, or they would just simply not listen to you. Whereas now, 10 years on, we're still having the conversation, but it's now a conversation that's much more productive. And for me personally, I've been engaged in that space for that entire time, and I felt a marked shift in the conversation and in people's willingness to listen to the ideas. And I think that's partially just the way of things. That ongoing dialogue and engagement is what does help us to move forward with these topics, and bringing people together in conversation as well. I mean, many of the projects that I have highlighted here brought together large groups of researchers with practitioners, from civil society organizations, to have conversations around some of these difficult topics, around past issues and the path forward. So the code of conduct conversation is a good example. That conversation actually originally emerged from a larger meeting of more than 125 people at a global think tank on the human dimensions of large-scale marine protected areas, and eventually moved it into a code of conduct, and now we're moving it into a conversation around social equity in the oceans. So that's a real example of that sort of trajectory. The second part of that question, the question around funding from organizations that may have had past issues in this space. I mean, that's a challenging big picture question. I mean, we get funding from government, we get funding from foundations, we get funding from individuals. Often, you know, for academics, we are I'm no longer in a university system, but most academics are within a university system. And so universities have rules of engagement around ensuring that you are, you know, distant from that that funding source, and that you have independence from that funding source. Yeah, so that's, you know, one response to that question is to ensure that you do have that academic distance and independence so that you can maintain your focus independently. Some people I know will choose not to take money from certain organizations as a result of the politics of where that money comes from. Other people I know feel differently about it, and they feel that through engaging with those funders and taking money from those funders, they may also be able to engage in conversation with those funders and move the conversation forward with those funders in a different direction. And in some ways, it may actually end up helping to hold those organizations to account for their own actions.
Difficult balance, I think, in some cases. That's really great. Thank you so much. And I think the points that you made around the need for conversation and the bringing people together to discuss those, I think the only way to achieve those aspirations of the UN Ocean Decade that you set out in your talk, and I guess the critique that you had of the Ocean Decade, is to really have those conversations and to bring a really diverse group of people that maybe haven't been willing to have that. And you kind of answered one of my questions, which was whether or not you had seen a shift in the discourse and in the funding and that whole world of social justice and equity over your time working in it. So thank you for answering one of my questions.
Yeah,
Michael, sorry, go ahead.
I will note that we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
And when I say we have a long way to go, I mean, many marine conservation organizations have natural scientists that are hired within their ranks, but they don't have social scientists that are hired within their ranks. Many ocean and fisheries programs in universities similarly have many natural scientists. They may have an economist, but they may not really engage with the broader set of social sciences that are out there and that can inform decision making. Similarly, ocean science funders, they often are quite willing to fund natural science projects, but not and economic and technological solutions, but not to move over into the social realm. And so, I think the UN Decade is a great example of where it's kind of there in the documentation for the UN Decade, but it's also always tacked on as well as like that. They've actually used that language in a bunch of places with the social sciences, and so it's not a central topic for them. We're also going to engage with this, and I think that we need to move beyond that in many of the organizations that we ocean organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure many of us on this call and listening to your talk have experienced that frustration when you've kind of had the call for interdisciplinarity, but actually you know that it's not that, it's an add-on. And I hope that the decade gives us an opportunity to maybe, as you said, move past that and to get some more proactive work in that space. And Michael, you've had your hand up for quite a long time, so I'm going to assume that you would like to talk and come on to screen. So I'm going to promote you to panelists, if you're happy to do that, which is hopefully working. Oh, here we go. Should be coming on. You can ask your question yourself if you're happy to.
Yeah, and you're still muted, Michael.
And I can't see you if you wanted to put your camera on, but you don't have to.
While we're waiting for Michael, shall we just take one of the other questions?
Absolutely, yeah. I was oh, here we go.
Yes,
Hi,
first
Michael,
of all, hi. First of all, my apologies. I have a computer failure that sent me scrambling to get this iPad, which is really not not good at all. So I'm sort of holding it up with one hand. So my name is Michael Keogh. I'm with a group called Coastal People Resource Protection Group, or we call it Coastal People RPG, in Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada. An excellent presentation this afternoon. I want to thank both of you for it, for the opportunity to participate. I'm a sort of a boots in the boats type of person, and many years so I've been involved in the fishing industry and interacted mainly with fishery scientists a lot. Social scientists rarely, and they've always been esoteric and way out in the field type of thing. Our coastal people really are quite fed up with scientists because they just don't trust them. We get out of Ottawa very, very poor management in Canada, we believe. And many of our coastal people have been badly victimized. They've been able to be portrayed as butchers and barbarians and, cultural misfits because they have to kill things from the sea and live. And so they have a lot of social aspects to carry on us as well. So I guess my question to you, Nathan, is, yes, we see a lot of studies, and yes, ad nauseum, and we see a lot of, keyboard warriors who want to put in many times things that we can't understand, we can't relate to. And it just doesn't get down to sea level, to our end of it. Our communities are dying. Our urban communities are dying. The jobs are gone to cheap labor countries. Our ocean resources have been claimed by multinational corporations. Our government has made a mess of managing our resources off our coast. We have seal populations that are almost 10 million. And we have all kinds of things going on here. But nobody seems to penetrate. So what's going to be different this time? What's going to happen, Nathan? Our people, the communities literally are empty. You literally can drive through our coastal communities and find empty houses boarded up and more. So how can you help that? Don't give us another written book. But anyway, thank you. It has been so wonderful to just listen to your enthusiasm. Emma, what a great service you've done. So thank you very much. I apologize for taking up so much. There's so much passion on the go here for this.
No apologies necessary, Michael. Thank you so much for your comment and for attending. Nathan, I'll hand over to you to respond.
Yeah, Michael, thanks so much for your question and for asking us to get real. Before I answer your question, I really like the idea of a keyboard warrior, and I think I'm going to call myself that from now on. So I guess you're not alone among people that live in coastal communities that are tired of researchers, that don't experience genuine engagement, and that don't necessarily see them represented in what is written, and also that don't necessarily feel that research is providing a path forward in terms of what we do about the very real issues that are facing coastal communities. And it's a point that I touched on very, very briefly in my talk, which was right at the end around future research, and it was around this idea of the research process being as important as the product. And I think there's lots of different ways of doing research. One is to come up with a theory or an idea that's based in academic literature and go and test it in a place, design your research instrument, go out to a place, go and test it through doing surveys and interviews and all that, and then step away and write your book. A very different way of engaging in research is through participatory engagement, right? Through saying, yes, we're excited about doing research, but we would like to do it together. We would like to explore questions that matter to us. We would like to tell our story, and we would like to try to represent what it is that we're experiencing, in terms of change over time, in terms of the impacts of change in fisheries and the environment and climate change. And also that we would like to try to chart a path forward together. I can think of many, many examples of where that sort of participatory engagement leads to a very different sort of output. I mean, just one example from the talk that I gave is the research that I've done on access in fisheries in Canada. All of that research was done in collaboration with a large group of individuals from, different civil society organizations here, from the university system, from communities, and we've spent time developing those projects, developing the surveys together, and coming up with the types of output that are going to matter for the types of initiatives that they're working on. I also just want to highlight, the work of Ruth Brennan, which I think is absolutely brilliant, where, she has worked to tell a different story of the seascape through documenting people's cultural values of and connections to the sea within the region where she works. And I think that she, her focus was also not just on producing academic outputs, but also on producing maps, on working with the community to tell their own story and to take that story and put that forward in front of policymakers and decision makers so that they had a path forward. I hope that answers your question, but I think there's a very different way of working, and you need to find the right social scientists that are willing to engage in that way. Emma, shall we?
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, thank you so much. I'm going to put you back onto as a normal attendee, but thank you so much for your comment, for being willing to come on screen. Yeah, I'll go through the rest of the questions. We've got some great ones. Nathan, there's a question from Robert Arthur who's asked, given that restricting access is often inequitable and the processes associated with it are unjust, are measures to enable access, including regulated, so conditional open access, then a justifiable alternative focus for fisheries management? So drawing on your experience in the fishing industry.
Yeah, I mean, darn, you just took the question away. That was a very complicated and multi-part question, so I was hoping to be able to continue to see it. Yeah, obviously, a big part of fisheries management and marine conservation is about regulating access. I think that I guess, first of all, it's a bit of a fallacy to think that, that there is utter and complete open access anywhere in the world, because for the most part, there are a whole series of regulations that are overlaying on the oceans. There's also informal mechanisms that get in the way of people's access. People also have capacity issues that get in the way of their access. And so the first thing is that, there's just not that many places where there is in the purest sense, an unregulated open access commons, right? That just doesn't happen. The second thing is that, is there a place for, some sort of regulation on that open access? Obviously, we obviously do need to make rules in order to, limit the amount that people take, to limit the species that they take, all of the rest of it. But often, the reason that I took a bit of a shot at, Hardin's tragedy of the commons is I think the diagnosis there is wrong. Most communities do have their own rules. Most fishers do have ethics. Most places in the world, there are different social structures and governance structures that are in place to manage or to regulate how much fishers take. What if instead, we looked at the fact that in many of these places where we're having these issues that we often diagnose as being about a tragedy of the commons or overpopulation? What if instead the real problem was the large scale industrial boat that goes through the area every 2 weeks and takes about 1,000 times as much as a small scale fisher can take in a day, right? And I'm thinking of a very real example of a place. This is what happens on the coast of Thailand, where at night big draggers come through the areas reserved for small scale fishers. So that was why I took a bit of a shot at there. There was a last part of the question, and now the question's gone. So I do think that regulated open access is necessary. I think probably one of the most important things is to figure out what rules are already in place, to design the rules properly, to make sure that we're addressing the real issue rather than the issue that we think is happening in that place and what's leading to overfishing. And yeah, again, I missed the last part of the question. So
you answered it. It's okay. It's all right.
Okay.
It's just whether or not that's a justifiable focus for fisheries management, which you got. So that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll leave the questions up from now on. I was trying to clear them, but I'll leave them. Okay, so I'm going to go to the question from John Thomas now, who's asked, how have you helped convince decision makers around the crime of logic that marine conservation is necessary, but clearly not sufficient to support human well-being for ocean-dependent people? It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So the crime of logic is, it's quite common, right? That we would assume that increasing the number of fish in the sea will automatically lead to human well-being. And the things that get in the way of that being true are first of all that in order to increase the number of fish in the sea, we do need to reduce access of some sort, right? And so you can think of marine protected areas as being an example of reducing access. When marine protected areas are put into place, they automatically restrict people's access to that resource, and therefore they might undermine people's well-being. In the long term, they might lead to a rebound in the resource, and therefore, at that point, they might increase people's well-being. So this is a time-dependent piece, right? And so this is something that I've been working to think through with marine protected areas: is how do we deal with that transition period during the rebuilding of fish stocks because of things like marine protected areas or other sorts of things. The other thing is, I worked on a paper with Sarah Klein around sea cucumber fisheries on the coast of British Columbia, and in that case, our general assessment was that sea cucumber fisheries on the BC coast were relatively sustainable, but that if you looked at the allocation of those resources, especially to Indigenous groups, they were highly unjust. And so, we work to try to articulate what a more just system might look like, both in terms of decision making as well as in allocation. I would like to, call out the recent papers by, I'm not sure the first name, but Hiron Nava has published a couple of recent papers around sustainable and well-being that I thought were quite brilliant in terms of testing this relationship empirically and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, I think this is an issue of a temporal issue. It's also an issue of allocation of resources between different groups. I do think that there's probably a lot more to do in terms of convincing decision makers that this crime of logic needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Nathan. So we've got a kind of research process question, I guess, from someone who hasn't given their name, but it's someone who's asking, within marine social science research, they found it difficult to engage with stakeholders that cannot easily be classified as business or NGOs or academics. So the real people, I guess the civil society that you've mentioned a couple of times, the communities that you've mentioned, who are the key people that we need to engage in terms of issues relating to social justice and equity that we've been discussing this afternoon. So how would you suggest that you get started in that kind of research process that is truly inclusive and yet can be limited by our own academic process timelines, our funding timelines, our resources? So I guess kind of exploring some of that research process that you mentioned in your talk.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. I think in my own work, most of my early work was community-based research, and that's partially because I came to research as a practitioner, and so I really wanted to bring the tools of participatory research together with my community work to help communities to explore questions that were of value to them, and help them to chart a path forward. And I think the things that really helped and enabled that to happen in a good and meaningful way was obviously to build relationships. To take the time to understand the context first, and to engage with people on questions that matter to them and on things that they wanted to explore. Trust is not something that comes easily. It's something that's built, and it's something that's gained. I think there's, it's possible to build trust faster or slower. If you're sleeping in a hotel in the town, 10 kilometers away, and then going to the community every day versus, staying in the community itself for a year straight, that's gonna change your ability to build trust in that community. Also not setting up unrealistic expectations with communities, right? I think it is possible to do participatory research and not be there forever. I think communities understand that people come and go, and that they, if you're clear about that and you are able to articulate and communicate what you're able to do for them and with them, that does help. Right? It says, I'm not going to be here forever, but I'm willing to engage with you on this problem during this time. And if you're developing the project together, I think they may find value in it. Also, you might need to be willing to not work with a community if it doesn't seem appropriate, or if it's not the right time. I've reached out to communities before to talk to them about working with them, and they've said, right now is not the right time to work with us. We have too much going on, and we're involved in some other sorts of stuff. Maybe reach out again in a year or two. We're thinking about that topic, but it's in the back of our minds for now. We're going to work on that later. So reach out again later. Lots to dig into there. I think, engaging with research on our writings on decolonizing research processes, engaging with writings on participatory research and knowledge co-production. I think all of those are going to be, provide more productive insights than I could provide in that 2-minute response.
Thanks, Nathan. I guess one of the key things with that point is that there is a need to build the time and resources into funding applications where possible to allow for those relationships to be built. And I think it's really difficult to do that because of our funding structures and because of perhaps the lack of consideration that's been given to social science topics in a marine and coastal context in the past. There's evidence to suggest here in the UK that some of that is changing. So we've got some examples of that, but I think there's still a way to go with that, as you said, around other topics relating to this. There was actually a follow-on question relating to this idea of engaging with research participants and with communities, from someone who said, how do you do this when you have to do it remotely or virtually? So how do you build a research process that is inclusive and ensures the equitable inclusion of voices and beliefs in a way that is meaningful and just and gives that engagement that you've talked about when we're doing it remotely, like we have been for the last year, or where you just can't get to a place and you have to do it from a distance for whatever that reason might be?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic and challenging question, and definitely one that a lot of people have struggled with during this last year. I mean, obviously, we've all experienced that it's possible to connect and build relationships virtually. It's not necessarily ideal, but it's still possible. And I think, I haven't actually done, that's not true. I've done some virtual research over the last year. But I think, engaging again with just the general sorts of ideals and ideas of participatory engagement, participatory research, good facilitation, I think those are going to be key. And I think moving those same sorts of ideals and ideas into the virtual space is possible. It does take, honestly, I think just as much work, if not more, to doing it in person. The amount of time you need to put into thinking it through, into getting good platforms that are going to help you to do what you're trying to achieve, and to connecting with individuals is going to be necessary. We're going to have to continue to pay attention to that process. There's definitely courses out there now too. I've noticed a lot of courses on how to do and reference materials on how to do good engagement, how to do good participatory research, how to do virtual research. But I think finding good partners, finding key people to connect with to make sure that you're doing things in the right way, still engaging with an advisory group. Asking them whether it's appropriate to do it virtually, or which methods are appropriate to do virtually, asking them whether it's possible to do it later. And then, another thing that I just want to note is that, I've noticed from some colleagues of mine that they've actually seen some positive movement as a result of COVID, in terms of that there's less helicopter research going on. There's less people flying into their countries and into their communities. And instead, people are partnering with them in a different way. And they're partnering with them to carry out the research in those places and in those communities, because they have the connections on the ground, because they have people that work in the communities. And so there's a transfer of resources, and there's a certain amount of capacity building that's going on for local researchers to carry out the work. And they have felt that this is a positive move away from people from the outside coming in and doing their own research without any consultation, and instead actually having to engage with them and give them the responsibility to lead the project and partner on the project. And ultimately, some of them are finding that they're actually getting included more often as co-authors on the papers as a result of this. And so I just want to say that there's also some potential positive here in moving more into a virtual space.
Absolutely. I think that's always the thing. There's challenges and opportunities always, and trying to see those is really crucial. But I guess, again, it's thinking about making sure that those resources, that time, that's built into projects, and that those are thought, but rather than it being this add-on of marine social sciences, that it is an integrated part of project design. I think that's really crucial. And we've been on for an hour and a half, and I'm aware that we should let you go about the rest of your day. So there's a comment from Cecile, who said that there's a lack of anthropologists in marine social sciences to do the context study that's needed to inform project design and to develop project timeframes. And I think we've talked about that a little bit, that our timeframes, our project proposal development structures haven't been designed in the past to allow for that process to happen. And perhaps there is a need to lobby funders to kind of, I guess, allow for that relationship building and that project proposal development to be part of, I guess, kind of seed funding, or, to actually design those projects so they are co-developed and meaningful for the communities that are working in, and would reach that kind of aspiration and that need for blue justice. Do you have any reflections on that for us to finish?
Yeah, no, thanks for kind of bringing it to close. That's a great question to bring it to a close with. I guess I also get a little bit frustrated with the focus of many conservation organizations and funders on monitoring and evaluation. And monitoring and evaluation is one way of thinking about social science, and it's an important way of thinking about social science and about your programs. It's understanding the impacts of your programs. But actually, even monitoring or evaluating like human well-being can have various purposes or functions. One is to set a baseline and to understand the social context, and then based on that understanding of the social context, to be able to design the future initiatives, to understand how you should be thinking about the initiative that you're doing in that place, rather than thinking of it just as something that you need to track whether you've done the right thing or not. You might actually do better to start by thinking of it as a design tool. So yeah, I mean, personally, I agree broadly with this point. I think it would be great to see more funders and more organizations thinking about the design phase and doing social science research at the design phase to help them think about the design of, blue economy initiatives, to think about how to create marine protected areas in a more equitable fashion, about how to design fisheries programs. I think all of these sorts of things are just, it's fundamental that we really have a solid understanding of the social context. And I want to just add to that I think we need to be cautious about framing our understanding of the social context through a Western social science framework. So this is something that we should be cautious about, and it's part of the reason why I advocate strongly for diversity, equity, and inclusion. What about if it's not just Western trained anthropologists and geographers and others? What if it's also Indigenous knowledge holders or Pacific Island philosophers that are engaged in that process of understanding the social context, or local knowledge holders of other types? What if they also are considered social scientists, and that the information and the way that they see the social context also needs to be brought into the design? So that was just an additional point. I think we need to be bringing Indigenous knowledge holders and local social scientists, if you will, into those processes of understanding social context and design of initiatives.
I'm so glad that is the point that we're ending on. What a perfect way to really, I guess, really sum up the themes of your talk and the issues around social equity and justice, and the fact that we absolutely need to be taking those different values, different ways of knowing and relating to marine and coastal spaces into consideration when we're talking. And it's thinking about who the we is. And I think that is a perfect place to end. I'm so sorry that we haven't managed to cover all of the questions, but I think we need to let Nathan go about the rest of his day. But what I'll maybe do is I'll send you the questions, Nathan, and perhaps we could put the answers underneath the recording and have them on the MarSocSci website as well, so that we make sure we respond to them. And there are a few people asking if the recording will be made available. Yes, it will be on our website and YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and I'll make sure to email everybody who registered and also promote it on social media in the next couple of days. It'll also should be in our next MarSocSci newsletter if you've signed up to that. Thank you again so much for such an inspiring and deep talk, but also the questions that we've had from the audience. We still have nearly 60 people here, nearly 40 minutes after the talk was due to finish. So I think it really shows how engaged everybody's been and what fabulous questions we've had. So I can only thank you, Nathan, for such a great session, but also to all our attendees, thank you so much. And I really look forward to seeing how this work continues in the future. So thanks again.
And thanks, Emma, and everyone for attending. I really appreciate it. The Marine Social Science Network is such an important initiative, and I'm really glad that you're moving that ahead. It's important work.
Thank you very much. All right, everybody, I'm going to close. Thank you so much, everybody. Lovely to see you all. Thanks, Nathan. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.